Hey makers, today's video is all about our most important piece of production equipment, the camera. I am going to do this a little bit different than the boot camps on audio, lighting, and editing. I really want to slow this down so that some of the concepts can really sink in. But I am going to do a head-to-head like I did with the microphone video, and I'm going to compare mirrorless, DSLR, small mirrorless, cell phones, action cams, and cinema cameras. I will keep the video as raw as possible, nothing beyond basic white balance and exposure settings, just so you can get as raw of a comparison as you can between these cameras, two at a time. Let's get into it. If microphones are all about audio and how it's received, then cameras are all about light and how it's received as exposure. You can control the exposure using the exposure triangle, and the easiest side of the exposure triangle to set is shutter speed. The lower the number, the longer the sensor is exposed to light. The higher the number, the quicker the shutter speed is happening. It's measured in fractions of a second. As a rule of thumb, set it at twice your frame rate. So if we're shooting at 30 frames a second, you want to set it at 1/60th of a second. But don't go below your frame rate unless you want to do this for a creative effect like we did in the welding video where I was shooting at a 30th of a second, but I set my exposure to 1/15th of a second to create those light streaks. If you're having flickering effect from dimmable LEDs, instead of going 60th of a second for 30 frames, go to a 50th or an 80th of a second. Get off of divisible numbers by 30, and this might help you get rid of some of those flickering issues. The next leg to our exposure triangle is ISO/gain. ISO goes back to analog film days where higher ISO film stock was used for darker situation and it was more sensitive. In video, it's known as gain because it amplifies the information being received by the sensor. The downside of amplifying this information is when you have underexposed areas, the sensor doesn't really know what it's looking at and you'll get noise artifacts. The extent of ISO and gain largely depends on the sensor's brand and size. Full-frame sensors have a larger surface area to receive more light information and in turn have higher ISO abilities. There is a ceiling for every camera whenever your ISO gets too high and you start automatically introducing way too much grain artifacts. Modern cameras like the FX3 have amazing range where you can see with your camera in situations where your eyes can't. Action cameras like the GoPro are really not meant for these darker scenarios. They're action cameras for outdoor sports, not really meant to be used in your shop where you don't have a whole lot of light going on. The third leg of our exposure triangle is the aperture. It is the most expensive by far. If you have a fixed lens camera like a GoPro, a point and shoot, or a cell phone, you're really limited by your camera's hardware. But if you have a DSLR, mirrorless, or cinema camera with an interchangeable lens mount, you're really limited by your wallet. Aperture is measured in f-stops and it works similar to the iris in your eyes. The iris in your eyes opens your pupil up to allow more light to come in, similar to the iris blades in my camera, which open up the aperture to allow more light to come in. One of the byproducts of this is actually a shallow depth of field. The depth of field is the depth of field of view in front of and behind the focal point. So a shallow depth of field is a wonderful thing if you want to control what your viewer is focusing on. Fun pun. But shooting A-roll like this as a talking head, if I have this shallow depth of field, then every time I move forward and back, I'm moving in and out of focus. Alright, if you've made it this far, go ahead and click like. If this is your second, third, or fourth boot camp that you've watched and you're actually getting something out of these, go ahead and let me know in the comments. The view count really isn't there on these videos, but I really think that a few of you guys are really getting something out of this, so just leave me a comment below. And if this is your third, fourth, or fifth video, go ahead and hit subscribe. I don't put out very often, but I think you're really going to enjoy the next bits of content. Image sensor is the next place you're going to have to spend some money. Larger image sensors like a full frame receive more light. They also help with a shallow depth of field. Crop sensors essentially crop the shot, creating a built-in zoom. This is awesome if you're doing action sports photography, not so much when you're trying to get a wide-angle shot in your workshop. A full-frame sensor is essentially a 35mm sensor. It's based on old film stock. Crop sensors literally crop the outside of a shot. So if a crop sensor like a Micro Four Thirds is a 2x, then it literally crops 2x all the way around. APS-C sensors are like a 1.4 and a 1.6 crop factor. By saving money on the sensor size, you actually have to spend more money on a lens to have that wider field of view. Another issue with image sensors and processors is found in this Canon M50. For me to get it into 4K, it builds in a 1.6x crop factor, and it can only shoot in 24 frames a second. Before now, we've talked about controlling light with the exposure triangle and what impact the image sensor has on it, but let's talk a little technical. And I'm going to give you some beautiful stuff to look at because I know this is going to get a little technical, and hopefully I've earned the likes so far, but I'm going to work hard to simplify these complex topics so I can earn your subscription. Let's start with 8-bit versus 10-bit. 8 bits, that's 256, red, green, and blue. When you multiply them together, that's 16 million colors, which is awesome if you had a crayon box with 16 million colors. But 10-bit is 1024 red, green, and blue, which is 1 billion colors. You can see here in the clip, maybe it's not as obvious in 4K, but it's a little more apparent whenever you see this in 1080 instead of 4K. And still, if you don't see a difference here, then don't worry about this. What about 420 versus 422 and 444? Take 4 pixels wide, 2 rows, all right? The first number is samples of luminance, that's light. The next number is how many samples on row 1, and the third number is how many samples on row 2. So 422, you have more color. 420, it's just going to copy the information. You can really see the difference with this in 1080 versus 4K for obvious reasons, but if you can't see a difference, don't worry about it. How about recording in RAW or log? Recording in RAW is like grabbing the raw information from the image sensor before it can be processed. Think of this like listening to someone in a native language before an interpreter can put their spin on it. Or like in the movie The Matrix, where Cypher can look at all the green code and see blonde, brunette, redhead, etc. You really don't need to worry about RAW recording if you're watching these videos. I don't even record in RAW, it's too much work. But recording in log is actually very helpful. Log recording is all about light on a logarithmic scale. It's kind of like having flat pack furniture that you can build out how you want in post-production. Recording in log helps to have more dynamic range. You overexpose when you shoot in log, and it gives a lot of detail in the shadows while not blowing out the highlights. When you put it into post-production, you put an effect on it, and boom, you've got automatic dynamic range. If you don't see a difference in these or you don't like it, then don't worry about it. Codecs and compressions, lossy versus lossless. If I say the words, "Do you know what I mean?" that's lossless. If I say, "Nah, I mean," that's lossy. All I or intraframe codec means that it is 24 frames a second. You have 24 individual pictures. If you go to something that's IPB like H.264 MP4 that we're all used to, that is a lossy codec. That means that you have 1 frame of video, your first frame, and then frames 2 through 24 are just the information that's different from the previous frame. This is awesome if you're doing time-lapse or not a lot of motion, but if you're trying to get those slow-mo shots, you're going to need something like intraframe. And again, if you can't see a difference, then don't worry about it. I'm hoping I earned the subscription by now, and if I haven't, check out one of these other boot camps on audio lighting, or the next boot camp that's all about camera, tripods, gimbals, jibs, cranes, sliders, etc.